Hey class, so today we're going to be talking about the Second Industrial Revolution. During this period, which is basically late 1910 to 1920, up into 1929, you'll notice that almost everything on here ends in 1929, and that's because after that, something crazy happens in 1929. And I'll give you a second to think about it. And that is the Great Depression. The stock market crashes and the Great Depression starts. And so all of these things about the high standard of living, people buying more cars, people living more in the city, having more electricity, all of that stuff kind of goes out the window once the Great Depression starts. That really changes what's happening in America. And the Great Depression is going to kind of continue until we get into World War II. But the 1920s, by most standards, is a period of high pay, lots of consumer products to buy, high standards of living, clean houses, houses that are clean water, houses with electricity, houses that are, for the most part, more modern, things like that. Things that mean that the people living in America are often healthier, happier, and make more money than people living in other countries at that time. And one of the main reasons for that is what Europe just went through before the 1920s, which is the World War. None of that was actually fought on American soil. So America doesn't need to rebuild, right? We don't have, 450 miles of trenches going through Arkansas and, up to Canada, right? That's not something that we're dealing with here. So that's a big problem that they're having to deal with in Europe that we aren't having affect us. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that were happening for the average American. The average American, their income increased 30% from 1920 to 1929. So if they were making $5 in 1920, by 1929, 30% more would be about $650. So that doesn't sound like a lot in today's money, but that would be a lot, especially if you're considering what it would be like back then. America was the highest paying country in the world at that time. And that's really in the world, even when you compare to Britain and France and Germany, who again are still rebuilding from World War I, we were the highest paying country in the world. Also, we were able to increase our production, meaning the amount of cars that we were producing, radios, even household items like dishwashers and things like that, washing machines. We don't have microwaves yet because that won't be invented until after World War II. But those types of items were being increased. Also things like clothing and whatnot. But we were able to double our production rates from our factories, but our workforce size didn't really increase. And that was mainly because we became more efficient, specifically with the assembly line. By 1920, more than half of the population was living in cities, so we are officially becoming more urbanized and less rural. Farmers, unfortunately, were still struggling. Farmers were making about $273 per year as an income versus the average American income being $681 per year. Now that doesn't look like a huge difference, but it is more than double, and the average American income is considering the farmer's income as well. So if the farmer's income was left out of that average, you could see that the average income would actually be closer to more like $800 or $900 per year, almost triple what the farmers were making. Electricity is beginning to replace steam, specifically in factories. By 1929, 70% of all factories in the United States were electric, and by And then 66% of Americans had electricity. So 2 out of every 3 Americans in the United States had access to electricity. We also end up having the modern assembly line, which causes not only there to be a far greater amount of cars out on the road, but it also causes the price of the cars to decrease to be more affordable. So from 1920 to 1929, the number of cars in America grows from 10 million to 26 million. So in 9 years, the amount of cars that people had driving around in America more than doubles. Also, the Model T by 1929 was actually only $290. I'm going to call your attention back up to what the farmers were making, and notice that a farmer could work all year and the average income would still be less than a Model T. On the other hand, we have just our average American who could buy a car and actually still have money left over. Now, that doesn't mean that we weren't giving out loans and things like that, but just talking about how far your money could go and what kind of purchasing power you have, the farmers have very little. So you know that that's going to end up causing some problems in the future as well. The new adolescent, so that actually would refer not quite to kids your age, but a little bit older, that teenage time frame. There are some new things that kids are having access to that really starts to change how America looks to a teenager. We have, because people are getting paid more, we actually see child labor rates decrease in the 1920s, and again, it will be banned altogether in the 1930s. Most children at this time are attending high school and even some college, and so that's a majority. Now we're only about 50%, about 55 or so percent of people going to college at this time, but that's still a greater percentage than before. Also, kids have more independence. Now that cars are affordable, you could actually have a date by taking your girlfriend out to the movies or going out to, kind of a lover's lane situation. That was never something that could have been possible before that. Usually in the Victorian era, if you were on a date, you were sitting in the living room with your parents, and often their parents, and having a conversation under the watchful eye of all of the adults. That doesn't, to me, sound like a very good way to start a date, right? And probably not to you guys either. Movies become very popular in the 1920s. Mind you, there's still going to be silent films, and also they're still going to be in black and white. The first talkie or sound film is actually going to be The Jazz Singer, and I believe that's 1925, I think. So it's coming out during this decade, and we'll officially get into color when we get a little bit closer to the 1940s. The first color movie being, oh darn, it's slipped my mind. It's with Scarlett O'Hara. Oh, okay, I can't remember right now, but it'll pop into my brain later and I'll say it. Sports, going out to sports games and competitions like boxing, baseball games, going golfing. These are new things that that the average American has access to. Jazz, we'll have a whole day on jazz tomorrow, actually. Jazz is going to be the new music of the 1920s. And though it will be mainly created by African Americans, and we still have a lot of racism and segregation in America at that time, jazz will kind of be the new cool thing for both races to go out and listen to and experience. And then the last thing on this slide is speakeasies. So a speakeasy is a bar that is serving illegal alcohol. In 1918, alcohol was officially made illegal with the 18th Amendment. So that's actually before women had the right to vote. And during that time, most people still wanted to go out and have a drink. I mean, America has been drinking since the Pilgrims came over. Ales and different things was what most people drank, even Puritans. So this was not something that most Americans wanted to give up. So it was making bootleg alcohol was called bootleg or moonshine, things like that. Anything that was kind of made illegally. Al Capone, who's a very famous gangster from this time period, actually was able to make $60 million a year, and that's in 1920s money. And that's not total, that's per year, primarily from selling illegally made or bootleg alcohol, sometimes called hooch, different things like that. So this really is something that is a huge part of the American culture, and that idea of kind of cops and robbers, the car chases with the gangsters. It was the gangsters really were able to come into power because they were dealing with this bootleg alcohol, and that's where they were making a lot of their money. So our very last slide is actually about the Flapper Girls. Flapper Girls were, again, a little bit older than you guys, but women in their late teens and early 20s who were coming of age. They were becoming adults in the 1920s. And they wanted to be radically different from their moms. Their moms had grown up in the Victorian era. And in the Victorian era, I'm just going to draw a picture for you guys real quick. In the Victorian era, the big thing that all the women were wearing, oh, it is not going to work. It was working earlier. Excellent. Okay. The big thing that all of the women were wearing, and I'm going to go back here, were corsets. And you've probably seen corsets. You know, the women would put them on, lace them up in the back, and it would make them very curvy, kind of that hourglass figure. Another thing during the Victorian era is most women had long hair that was worn up in a bun, or young women maybe down in braids, but often worn up, kind of up in some sort of bun, something like that. And the dresses were very long and flowy. You often couldn't see anybody's ankle. They went down to their wrists, and sometimes they would even have a collar that would go part of the way up their neck. So the young women who are coming of age in the 1920s, they want to completely go away from the way that their parents wanted them to dress. So often instead of having long hair, they would have very short hair, and you can see that in some of these pictures. You can see here, all of them are wearing very short haircuts. They would wear short skirts where you could see their knees. How scandalous, right? Could you imagine? And also, and this is kind of one of the odd parts that they did, is they would do something that was called rouge their knees. So rouge is another word for blush or makeup, kind of that red makeup. And they would actually wear stockings, because a lady would always wear stockings in the Victorian era. And then they would roll their stockings down to about their calf, and they would put this red rouge on their knees to really try to make their knees stand out, and to say, like, okay, Mom, I'm going to wear stockings, but I'm not going to wear them the way you want me to. I'm going to wear them in a way that they actually draw attention to the fact that I'm wearing a short skirt. So you will see my knees, and I'm actually going to make sure that my knees stand out by putting extra blush on them. It's a very weird style choice, and I don't think any of you guys are going to be rushing to do that anytime soon, but that was something that was actually done. Additionally, because they were trying to move away from this curvy hourglass look that was standard during the Victorian era, they wanted to actually wear not necessarily oversized, but very clothing that made them look very flat and straight and not have any curves. So some women actually would bind their chest with ace bandages to try to take their curviness away. So these really are very big stylistic changes, and flappers were seen as, kind of like you know, the girlfriend of these gangsters or mobsters. They were kind of seen as really rebellious young women who weren't living a life that that was expected of them. So these really were like the, you know, the rebel girls of the 1920s, sneaking into speakeasies, listening to jazz, which was kind of you know, kind of Negro music, or considered music that was only for African Americans at that time. So that is actually it for, not for the whole chapter, but for the first section here. Tomorrow we'll be talking about jazz and listening to some jazz music and kind of comparing that. I hope you guys have an excellent day, and I will talk to you later.